Okay, James, thank you.
All right.
Appreciate you being here.
My pleasure.
Yeah, awesome. Awesome to have you. There's so many areas I want to go in with you. I don't really know where to begin. We usually start the shows with our guests and we talk about something current that you have going on or coming in the very near future. And I don't know if we want to start with art with you, if we want to start with the studio, events that you're holding there.
Well, just for a quick plug, I do have my studio, my sculpture studio is in uptown in Pittsburgh, near Mercy Hospital, and I have events there from time to time. I'm not like an official venue, but I say that, but I am kind of a venue. But it's not a business, it's more of just something that I've always liked to bring different kinds of people into my studio and mix. I always think it's good for artists to mix with other types of artists, writers and poets and sculptors. And I think a lot of time people separate into their groups and become isolated. So I've always had different kinds of events in my place, from films to poetry readings to music, and especially a lot of music these days. And on February 2nd, Badia Saad, who is a really great Brazilian singer-songwriter, will be in Pittsburgh, and she's going to play in my place. So, but that's what's happening currently in my studio. And then, as far as what I'm making, I make a lot of sculptures and mosaics, as you know. And right now I'm making a mosaic for a Café du Jour, which is a long time favorite cafe restaurant of mine that's in the South Side on Carson Street.
Right.
And I'm doing a facade for them, the outside. So
Okay.
it's really fun to do that.
Is this something that you would make at your studio and then take there and install?
Yeah, all of my mosaics are made off-site on panels and then stuck on the site when they're done. Yeah.
So let's start at the beginning.
It's always the best place to start, I guess.
I think generally it is. You're a lifelong Pittsburgher, right? Peabody High School? Is that right?
They made us swim naked in Peabody High School. If anybody doesn't know that, they should. I think it's one of the great things of folklore of my generation, right? Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Swim class in Peabody High School.
Oh my gosh.
The boys had to swim naked. The girls did not. And I think that was a citywide policy. So I don't know when it started. I Googled it once, started I think in the 50s, and I think it ended in the late 70s. And it was definitely one of the more gruesome things I had to put up with in my high school
I can't even imagine.
Experience.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, I went to Peabody High School, graduated in 72, and and really, I got my start in art in Peabody High School. I was one of those people that was one of those kids that was lucky enough to have a great ceramics art teacher at a time when I didn't really like school. I'm not really school material, like public school material. I don't like sitting in class, and especially back then. And but there was a great ceramics teacher there, and I fell in love with his class, and he introduced me to clay.
Okay.
And I started to make clay sculptures there, and he was very encouraging. He brought out the best in all his students. There's a lot of his students over the years that became professional artists in one way or another. He really inspired a lot of people. And so that's where I was really introduced to art, and which, kind of gave me the roots for, my further adventures after I left Peabody.
And there was a couple of national awards from your art from your high school years. Is that correct?
I did win national awards, and I still have them, but I didn't bring them today.
That's okay. No, that's okay.
Thanks to my mother. Yes, I won a couple national awards. There were gold keys that are little trophies.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you finished high school, and then you set out on this journey.
Yeah, I had traveling blood. It's not something it's just some people have, different. Some people from the time they go into high school, they just want to become some kind of lawyer or doctor. They study all the time. Other kids just want to do drugs and fuck off.
Right.
And I really, from 10th grade on, I just wanted to travel.
Okay.
I wanted to see the world. It was really like burning in my blood. And we hitchhiked a lot when we were in high school, because back in those days, everybody hitchhiked to and from school. It was kind of normal. And I wanted to kind of spread that further than to and from school. And so probably my first epic adventure was when we were 15, me and my friend Barry Pollock decided to hitchhike to Florida. And we...
at 15?
At 15, yeah.
Oh,
and
my
we
gosh.
did do that. We told our parents. I told my parents I was going to a friend's house for the weekend. Barry told his parents for the weekend. Yeah. Barry actually told his parents the truth, and they were. I think his dad was like, "I don't want to stop you. Have a good time," which I was kind of pretty amazed about that. He didn't tell me that till many years later. But yeah, we got ourselves to the highway on like a Friday afternoon, and it was one of those kind of coming of age trips where everything was magical from the time we hit the highway we got rides with colorful, eccentric, wacky people all the way along the way, all the way down to Florida. And we were gone about a week or so, maybe 10 days.
I was going to say, I'm guessing you probably didn't get back home by Monday.
No, I called my mama from Miami, and she wasn't too happy about it, but not much she could do about it. I had very nice parents, very cool parents, but I don't think any mother wants to see their kid hitchhiking away at 15. So that was a great start, and that really kind of put the traveling bug full steam ahead into my desire to travel. And then I came back to Pittsburgh, and from then on, I didn't really want to finish high school, but my parents begged me to finish high school. And so I agreed to finish high school, which I did. And then after that, actually literally the day after we graduated, had our graduation day, not ceremony, but just where they say you're done.
Right.
Me and Barry, my same friend, we went on the highway. At that time, his dad actually drove us to the highway. We hitchhiked to Berkeley, California, where his sister was living in a hippie commune. And that was the beginning of many years of traveling. Yeah.
So if I understand this correctly, you traveled back and forth from east to west a few times.
I did. I never
in the 70s.
I never returned to Pittsburgh to live from that day we left Pittsburgh from high school until my later on in my life when I came back to help out my parents. Mm-hmm. But I hitchhiked a lot all over. Hitchhiked to California that first time, and then I lived in the Bay Area for a while. Mm-hmm. Hitchhiked up to Oregon, hitchhiked up to Canada, lived on an island off the coast of British Columbia for a couple years. Mm-hmm. Hitchhiking in those days was a lot more. People did it, I don't know. I don't think it's so. It's a different time now.
Sure. Was it safer then?
I don't know if it we hitchhiked through the deep south when we were 15. Was it safe then? They were probably still lynching people back then.
Probably, yeah.
Nice little Jewish boys with long hair.
In the early 70s.
I don't know how safe that was, but I think I always had some angels maybe looking over me, but yeah, I never really had any problems. So yeah, a lot of hitchhiking in Canada too, east to west coast many times, and also jumping freight trains.
Yeah, I saw that in your bio too.
Yeah.
How's that work exactly? That always fascinated me.
Well, when we first did it, we thought you actually jumped freight trains, which we learned very quickly was not what you really did from all the local bums that hang around the tracks. Said, no, you'll kill yourself. You got to find a train that's parked. Ask everybody around. Most of the vagabonds or whoever around will know which one's going where. And you get on it. Well, it's stopped. You find like a a door that's open and you climb in, and then it goes, and then you get off. You know where it's going more or less, and then you get off. When you get off, though, you have to jump while it's moving. That's the most dangerous part, because you don't want to ride into the station where the security guards are.
Gotcha.
So it slows down really slow and you jump off. But when you jump off, you have to run when you jump off, like run into the direction it's going, or you fall backwards.
Okay.
So we kind of learned how to do that. It's a little bit dangerous, but super, super fun. Especially, like you go through a lot of wilderness in British Columbia and see all kinds of wildlife. It's almost like being on a safari back then to be on the freight trains in the middle of Canada. Yeah.
How did you find? Can you give me a feel for what America in the Bay Area was like in 72, 73? Because that was right after. Was it right after the hippie generation? Was it pretty much right? Was that just subsiding?
Yeah, I mean, the whole 60s thing was still very strong in the 70s in the Bay Area. I mean, maybe to the people that were in the thick of it in the 60s, they thought it was over.
Okay.
But for the vibe was still very strong.
Haight-Ashbury was still a thing?
Yeah, totally. And yeah, it was still like a fabulous place. I think it went all the way up through the 70s before it started the gentrification and stuff started to change it. But yeah, like the Grateful Dead were really big, and Jerry Garcia used to play at the Keystone Cafe every week, in Berkeley when he wasn't playing with the Grateful Dead, and it was a big scene, and it was a blast, really.
What'd you do out there?
And it was cheap, like Berkeley in those days, because Berkeley was kind of the center of Berkeley was pretty radical in the 60s.
No doubt.
And
some will argue it still is.
that Berkeley and Ann Arbor, Michigan were like the two big radical colleges where a lot of the professors and the anti-Vietnam War, energy came from.
Right.
But it was cheap in those days, so you could live in the middle of Berkeley. It was cheap, the whole, because it was cheap. Like a lot of the big cities were dirt cheap in those days. It made a different possibility for the kind of things you would find in the cities.
Okay. Did you do art when you were there?
No, I didn't do art. This was the beginning of my traveling days.
Okay.
So I was really the first part of my life. I was really just traveling around, seeing what was going on. Really trying to just learn about everything and see what people did, exploring. I didn't really know what I wanted to do.
Okay.
What I did in high school. I didn't really think, now I'm going to be a sculptor. I didn't have any idea. So you meet carpenters and woodworkers and stained glass window makers and lots of arts and crafts people. At least I met a lot of people like that.
Right.
And I tried a lot of different stuff. And in Berkeley, we got jobs, like just labor jobs, tearing down houses in the Bay Area that were and actually in Haight-Ashbury that had fire damage and so did a lot of like labor construction stuff, picking fruit too, stuff you do when you're on the road that you just make cash.
That seems like, to anyone listening to this, probably that just seems like a completely difficult life, but also very adventurous and very non-conventional.
It was really a lot of fun, and I think the atmosphere was more conducive of that back in those days. I wasn't like the only person doing that. And then I spent a lot of time in Eugene, Oregon.
Okay.
I hitchhiked up to Eugene, Oregon. Actually, I was hitchhiking. I can't remember why. Maybe I was visiting my parents back east, and then I hitchhiked back west again. And these people picked me up. And they, it was like a kind of ride, the classic ride you would get in those days, where there was a car full of people, and they were all different kinds. There was old people, young people, kids. Every one of them was a character, and all like really, really fun. And they said, we're going to the Renaissance Festival in Eugene, Oregon. Do you want to come? And I'm like, sure. And so we were in the Midwest somewhere. So we went to the Renaissance Festival. I think this was like 1973, right after high school, a little bit after San Francisco, maybe 1974. And so the Renaissance Festival in Eugene, Oregon took place in the countryside, and it was this bunch of hippies and musicians and arts and crafts people that just built like these little booths in the woods, and they had this really like 3-day festival of music and camping out and whatever. And that was like the first or second year. I think that was the second year that they had done it. It's still going today. Now it's called the Oregon Country Fair.
Okay.
And it turned into a bigger and bigger and bigger and wilder thing. Like when I was in Eugene in the late 70s, it was kind of at its peak of its still original flavor. And there was like the great Karamazov brothers, who were these guys that became famous jugglers. I think they were even on Johnny Carson.
Okay.
They would come there and juggle naked every year at the midnight show. I don't think they were naked on Johnny Carson.
You never know.
They were pretty amazing. They're probably still around, but they're definitely a lot older. But they would juggle. There was like 5 of them, and they'd juggle frying pans and lit propane torches and butcher knives and machetes all at once. It was pretty hilarious. But yeah, it was a really eccentric, wild country fair. That
did you feel like you went to the circus almost?
It was like the circus, and back in those days, and I don't know about now, there was a really big movement towards kind of reviving vaudeville.
Okay.
And there was a whole like vaudevillian kind of school in Seattle, and a lot of these people would come down to the country fair and practice their juggling and fire eating and, you know, various vaudeville type influences. So that was a blast, but yeah.
When you were in that time, did you ever think to write your experiences, or did you, even at that time, photography isn't what it is today with the digital era, of course, but do you have photos from that era? Do you have some history? I
don't have anything from I have a little bit from that, but I did have a really nice Pentax camera back then.
Okay.
My friend Morris in Pittsburgh, who's still in Pittsburgh, he was into cameras back when we were in high school, and he gave me a really nice Pentax camera. In those days, that was a nice camera.
Sure.
And I had that with me for many adventures, and I do have a bunch of slides still from various times in my hitchhiking days. Yeah.
So how did you get over to Europe? What was the decision like to go to Europe? You know, obviously, I guess you had gone back and forth on the States and in Canada, right?
I was itching to get out of the country.
Okay.
And first, it was Mexico. Mm-hmm. You know, I hitchhiked down Baja California.
Okay.
And had adventures down there. This was before there was a highway. There was no highway in Baja California in the 70s. I don't remember when the highway was built, but that was a great, adventure in itself to go to that part of Mexico and then go over to Mazatlan. Back in those days, it was just all wild and jungle. There wasn't really cartels or anything.
So was that safer than it is today?
It was, yeah, you could sleep on the ground anywhere, and yeah, it was a delightful time to be in Mexico.
Okay, and this happened before you went to Europe. You went to Mexico first. Okay.
And then I can't remember exactly what got me to go to Europe, but when I was, I grew up, my family was Jewish, not like in any, in a very, we weren't, what's the word? Progressive. We were. They weren't very religious, but we were Jewish.
Okay.
So my family were. I grew up in the Jewish community. My family were Jewish, and in that world, a lot of kids went to kibbutzes back in those days. Kibbutzes was a very popular thing for Jewish kids to go to when they were out of high school or they were in college to like experience living in another country, and they made it very easy for kids to go over there. They had a volunteer, or you could organize to go to a kibbutz as a volunteer, and they give you a place to live and work and all that stuff, and you kind of experience what it was like to live in that world in Israel, which I thought, well, that would be fun to do. So I think they even had like kibbutz offices in the West Coast, and I looked it up, and they hooked me up, and I saved a little money, and I got myself over to Europe, and I went to Israel and went to the kibbutz. And I probably lasted maybe 10 days there. And, it was like, oh, this is really cool. But everybody I meet here have just traveled all over the world and had all these adventures. And I don't want to sit here and like pick fruit. I want to like go and travel around the world.
Right.
So I said goodbye to the kibbutz after about 10 days. And then I was going to fly to Kenya. I found a really cheap flight to Kenya because I always wanted to go to Africa.
Okay.
And this guy I met said, don't go to Kenya, go to Istanbul. You can get, we went from Israel to Greece, which is very close from Israel. And he said, you can go from Istanbul all the way to India for like nothing. It's super cheap.
Okay.
And you can take the train. I said, okay, I'll do that. I was kind of always improvising back then. I still do. But, and so I went with him to Istanbul, and we got the Orient Express, I guess is what it is or was. Mm-hmm. And we took the train from Istanbul through Iran and Afghanistan and Pakistan. In India, it took about a month. And it was very cheap. And I was lucky enough to be able to see places like Afghanistan before all the wars. It was before the Russians, before everything.
Right.
So I got to see a really fascinating country before it got devastated by everything. And I was in Iran when the Shah was still in power.
Right.
I got a little taste of those places. I got more of a taste of Afghanistan because I actually spent about a month there. And when I say cheap, it was 10 cents for a hotel, and it was like 10 cents for a full course meal. It was really, really hard to spend $1 a day.
That's incredible.
So you didn't really need much money in those days. If you made $100, doing some kind of labor somewhere, you could really travel for quite a while on $100.
No doubt about it.
So that's, that was one of the worlds I had entered into,
that whole free, that wandering spirit, just to get up and go. Now I understand you were younger then. I get that part, but that's so. I think most people can't get there. To be able to be that carefree and to be that inquisitive about life and just go without really an agenda, a plan. Does that make any sense? I mean, in today's world, I think because we're all so interconnected now with devices and everything else, it just seems so like another world.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I was in that world, so I met a lot of people that did that. But it is true. I mean, that's not something that I think has to be in your blood, Because for me, it's not that I was a super brave person. It's more that I didn't see that as being brave because it was so easy for me to do.
We enjoyed it.
Yeah, and I mean, when you travel like that, it's not all just like fun and adventure. You can be stuck on the highway by yourself in the rain and the cold, and like saying this is miserable. There's plenty of things you have to deal with, but not like not life-threatening kind of deal with. Traveling is always a mix of really fun and really miserable. I think.
Were you ever? Did you ever feel you were in danger on those trips? Were there dicey moments that you can remember?
Very seldom, actually.
Okay.
More in the United States, I probably more than anywhere. I was picked up once by some kind of devious characters, and they were like, the guy was like cleaning his fingernails in the back seat with a knife, and they were like sort of looking through my backpack while I was in the front seat, and it didn't look like it was going to end well. But then I think the angels were looking over me because their radiator started to overheat, and they had to immediately pull into a gas station. And as soon as they pulled into a gas station, I grabbed my backpack,
took off,
and said, "I gotta go, bye-bye." But that was seldom that I felt threatened like that.
When you were in Europe and traveling like that, was most of the trip, were you going solo, or did you meet up with people that you traveled with?
Yeah, I think it was both. I it often happens that you start out by yourself and then you just meet all kinds of really interesting people. By the time I was traveling through the East, like there was probably 7 or 8 of us all together that were like on the train going through Turkey and Iran, and we kind of grouped up with all these really super interesting people.
Okay.
So yeah, part of the adventure is you meet a lot of fascinating people and befriend a lot of people.
Were you creating while you were traveling? Were you drawing? Were you immersed in art at any time?
Absolutely nothing.
Interesting. Interesting. And I'm guessing that happened when you were in Sao Paulo. Well, I guess we're going to get there.
Actually, I was more, I grew up with music. My dad was a violinist, so I played a little violin when I was a kid, but not a lot.
Okay.
But I was attracted to the mandolin back then, and I bought a mandolin in Greece, and so I traveled a lot with a mandolin. So I did play a little bit when I was traveling. Yeah.
Okay, so that was your accompaniment then on your travels.
Yeah.
So what's the story? Was it the same era that you made your way to Oxford?
No, that's a different.
Is that a different trip over there?
Yeah, way different trip.
Okay,
yeah,
I'm trying to tie it all together. You've done so much traveling. I'm trying to tie this all together. So let me ask you this. Did you travel and live in Australia before you went to Oxford?
Yeah, Australia was still in the first chapter there.
Late
in the
70s?
early days, yeah.
Late 70s?
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about that, because I read that you were living with the Aborigines.
Not living with the Aborigines, but
studying their culture.
Influenced by the Aborigines.
Let's talk about Australia. What was the idea to go there?
Yeah, the idea was it was back when I was I was in Athens. Athens was kind of the center of. You always sort of came back to Athens because from the east it was like there, and from the Middle East it was there. And I love Greece. I spent a lot of time in Greece.
Okay. Walking
around on the especially Crete. But anyway, I was in Athens and I was sitting. I can hardly believe I remember all this stuff. I was sitting in some cafe with everybody, and this guy came up to me and he just said, "Do you want to go to Australia? I have a ticket. You can have it. The only catch is you have to leave like to 3:00 this afternoon." And I'm like, "Sure." That was it.
It's only Australia. Sure, I'll go.
I'll go. What the hell? So I took his ticket, and I got on the airplane. And I flew to. I didn't get a visa, so they told me I had to stop in Manila on the way, for a couple of days and get a visa.
The Philippines.
Yeah, in the Philippines. So I stopped in Manila. The whole airplane thing was so much different back then. They would let you do that. You could. There was a lot of flexibility with traveling. You could fly standby anytime.
Yeah.
And it was pretty cheap. So I got my visa in Manila, and then I went to Australia. And I will add, this was a quirky time in that I was in my no shoes time.
Your no shoes era. How much of this travel did you go barefoot?
Really. I got it in my head that shoes were really bad to wear, and
okay.
So I was traveling without shoes, and they actually let me on airplanes without shoes and stuff. But the Australian customs didn't think too fondly of that, but they did let me in. They checked every bit of stuff I had in my backpack, but they let me in. Anyway, I was in Australia, knew nothing about Australia, and I was at a bus stop asking people for some directions or something. And I met this woman named Flavia who was at the bus stop, and she kind of came and rescued me and was really friendly. She was this beautiful Italian girl. She was like my age. And she said, "Oh, we have a farm, outside of Sydney. Why don't you come with me? We'll go to the farm." So anyway, I went to the farm with her, and we, I had a big adventure there for like a year. They had fruit orchards, and we picked fruit, and we sold fruit to the markets, and I had a big love affair there, and it was just this fantastic 1-year adventure. But somewhere in the middle of all that, I hitchhiked from Sydney to Darwin, And Australia is a big country, and between Sydney and Darwin is really thousands of miles
Right.
of hardcore desert and a lot of Aborigine country. And yeah, so in that stretch between Sydney and Darwin, and especially Darwin was very Wild West back then. I have no idea what it's like now, but it was very primitive back then. There was a lot of indigenous people on the streets, and the Aborigines were everywhere. And I didn't know at the time that the Aborigines had an influence on me, because that was like, sometimes the biggest influences you have in your life, you don't actually know till later that they were big influences on your life. But they were striking people, and just visually, just their faces, and their faces look like the earth, ancient souls. And I had one of the weirdest experiences in Darwin, and I went to a movie, and the movie was 2001: A Space Odyssey. And the movie theater was just this big kind of room or hut with a dirt floor, and everybody in the movie theater was Aborigine except me. It was all
Okay.
Aborigines and me watching 2001: A Space Odyssey. It was totally bizarre.
That's bizarre.
And as soon as it came on, in the very beginning, they have the monkeys jumping around. I don't know if you've seen that.
I
with
have
the
seen that
bone.
movie. Yes.
And when the monkeys were jumping around with the bone, the Aborigines were in hysterical laughter, like they were rolling on the floor, hysterical laughter. And I'll never forget that, because that was like really fun and oddball, and it's just,
and there you are.
that was something else. But yeah, so
How long in Australia total for you?
I lived there a year in Australia.
Okay.
Yeah.
And from there, why did you leave Australia, or did you just decide it was time?
Yeah, it was time. My relationship thing it was like the end of it, and in a good way, but it was like everybody had to move on.
Right.
The farm broke up, and it was like I was in, in still the beginnings of my incredible traveling obsession. So it was time to go somewhere else.
Okay.
And then I went back to Israel.
Okay.
And then I was like ready to actually work on a kibbutz, because I was like, now I can get into it. I've been traveling a while, and so then I spent about a year in Israel after that. Yeah.
What was that like?
The kibbutz was fantastic, really. You met all these people from all over the world that were volunteers. The kibbutz I was on, and I wasn't that aware of I wasn't like my family wasn't religious, so I wasn't that aware of the politics in Israel.
Okay.
I mean, everybody was aware that there was a lot of wars there and conflict and stuff. You had to know something about that, but the kibbutz was kind of, because they're almost gone now from Israel, the kibbutzes, but they were kind of an interesting kind of communal socialist setup.
Okay.
That was very successful and doesn't really exist that in the world. It's hard to find that kind of setup where people they had their different jobs, and then they would change every so often unless you were like a specialist at something, and the kids grew up like being taken care of by the whole community, and then would spend more like just the weekends with their parents. It was a really interesting, I think very successful kind of venture into a kind of an alternative lifestyle that wasn't like, not that it's bad, but like hippies and communes and stuff, but it was more like set up functioning and working as businesses and picking fruit, the fruit industry and the farming industry in kind of a cooperative way. And then they had all these volunteers that helped, too. It was a great experience. And for me, I met a lot of, I'm always somebody that likes to meet all kinds of different types of people, and you would meet, all these nomadic Arabic people that lived in the desert, and Bedouins, and all kinds of interesting Middle Eastern people that you normally find. And,
right.
That was a pretty great experience.
When that ended, Was that on a set time when you started, or could you have just stayed there if you wanted to?
Yeah, it was whatever you wanted to do, really.
Okay, so how did you know it was time to move on?
I think about a year it was just done. I don't remember why.
Okay.
It was just like people were, most people don't stay there more than probably a year or so anyway as a volunteer. It's like you work and work and work. But I didn't have any money. So a lot of people went down to Eilat, which is a fancy resort town, but back then it didn't exist. They were just building it. So all the hippies and ex-convicts would go down to Eilat, and they were the super cheap labor for the construction world. So I helped build Eilat for maybe a month.
Okay.
And that was like, and you got paid like $1 or $2 a day, which if you work 10 hours a day for 10 days, you could travel a long ways with like $100.
Got it.
So the whole idea of money back in those days made different possibilities if you knew how to travel cheap. So I spent some time in Eilat working construction, and we all lived in the desert. There was a gigantic cardboard shanty town. Everything was built out of cardboard.
Okay.
And people and hippies and ex-convicts and everybody lived in these little cardboard shacks, and it was super fun. I don't know if you'll ever meet anybody else in the world that remembers the cardboard shacks.
I thought it was fun.
In the sand dunes of Eilat. It was super beautiful.
Wow.
So
from there, did you go back into Europe at that point?
I think then, I can't remember exactly without like looking at my notes or something, but
right.
I ended up after that back in the United States.
Okay.
It was time to go back to the United States. And then I went back to Eugene, Oregon, which is a place I'd gone back to often. It was kind of like my base in the United States for many years. And at that time in Eugene, Oregon, I befriended these people, Ray Ennis and Michael Ostowski and Steve Miller, and they have rented this house on Augusta Street for if you need the details.
Sure.
And
I'll take anything you want to give me.
And the phenomenal thing that was going on for me at that time in Eugene, Oregon, is these guys were building what they called house trucks. So, if you were in the West Coast in those days, and you still see it sometimes, you see people buy school buses and convert them into really cool, living spaces and a variety of types of, buses like that have been converted. But this was like, they took it to like a way higher level. Michael and Ray were absolutely fantastic woodworkers. And so in Eugene in those days, you could buy logging trucks because it was a big logging area. You could buy old logging trucks for like nothing, for like $500. And those things were like big flatbeds that you could carry a lot of weight on. So they decided to frame houses on the backs of the logging trucks. So they just built these incredibly beautiful structures, which was super lightweight compared to logs.
Right.
With wood floors and skylights and stained glass windows and wood burning stoves and unbelievable.
It's like a custom RV.
Custom.
People would live
structures.
Out of them, right?
Yeah, and the hippies, everybody was crazy about it because the license plates were motorhomes, and because it was motorhomes, the police were not allowed to enter because it was the same as being in a house. They weren't allowed to enter without a search warrant, which for some of those people was a big deal because you could smoke pot and they couldn't come in, But and so I actually have a book at home. Somebody made a book of documenting all these beautiful house trucks that were built. There must be maybe 15, 20 of them, and they were really astonishing creations, every one more beautiful than the other. And yeah, that was a great experience to befriend these people and watch them do this stuff.
Right. And they said stained glass too, because that was something obviously you were into.
Yeah, so they I taught myself how to do stained glass there because I met people that were doing stained glass. I learned basic carpentry because my friends were all carpenters and we all needed to find work. So, you'd lie to people and tell them you were a carpenter, and then you'd go to the site and, run into your van to see how to build a frame, a little wall, and then come back and do it. Whatever you had to do to make your couple of bucks an hour. But yeah, that was a great time in Eugene.
So if I'm reading the material correctly, and again it says while in Europe in the 80s. So am I guessing Eugene was roughly in the early 80s? Is that about right?
Eugene was a mix of 70s and 80s.
Okay.
Yeah, on and off, depending. And then in Eugene, I met a guy, Roger O'Donnell, who was a violin maker.
Okay.
And he was like a really bad violin maker. No offense, Roger. And, he was, the butcher, but he was, he loved it, he loved doing it. And so I made a violin with him, and, I can't even say he taught me the basics, but I made something that looked like a violin with him. And it was, he kind of got me interested, I got a taste a little bit of the violin world, the amateur violin world. And then, I went back to Europe. Why did I go back to Europe? At that time I was playing violin a little bit.
Okay.
And I met these people. This is a whole nother story, but I met these people. My friend David Bruska, and he was an incredible violinist and a violist. And he said, you need to meet this woman, Kado Havas, because Kado Havas is this amazing violin teacher that teaches the way the gypsies play. And that really appealed to me.
Okay.
So she was giving a workshop in California. So we hitchhiked down to California and went to her workshop, and I completely fell in love with her whole shtick, and which was quite an amazing shtick.
Okay.
She was a child prodigy.
Right.
She was Hungarian. She grew up with the gypsies. She became one of the great, classical violinists. Playing Carnegie Hall when she was 17, and then she went on to she actually quit the whole performance world early after that and fell in love and got married and decided her first half of her life from childhood to teenager was all violin, and she wanted to have another life, so she got married and had kids and dropped the whole performance thing. And then during that time she developed just because it was in her world of I don't know, spontaneous world of meeting people, she started to teach, but she started to teach, with a lot of thought of how the gypsies had influenced her when she was a kid, and she started to teach with a lot of what she learned from the freedom of the gypsies, how they played. Anyway, her whole way of teaching was fascinating to me, so I went to a workshop and I met her, and I took the workshop and I fell in love with her, and then I decided to go study violin playing with her in Oxford. She lived in Oxford.
Okay.
And I wasn't planning. I wasn't good enough to be a professional violinist or anything like that. I didn't care. I just wanted to do that, so I did that. I saved some money, and I went over there and shared a house with some people and took some lessons from her, and then she said, you should meet Andrew Dipper. He's this incredible violin maker. He lives in Oxford.
Right.
Well, she was in Oxford. He says he lives right outside of Oxford. So I went and I met Andrew Dipper, and then I completely fell in love with the musical instrument making world. Andrew Dipper was and is one of the great restoration people for musical instruments. He restores really valuable old instruments from the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, and works for all the major museums in the world. Not so much violins, sometimes violins, but more lutes made in Venice and really highly decorative, unusual instruments. His specialty was repairing those things, but takes an enormous amount of skill and knowledge and research. And back when the days when there was no internet,
right,
he had to go to Italy and scour the libraries and teach himself Italian so he could translate, varnish making from the 1500s, all that stuff. So he was a very special talent. So I went there and I fell in love with the shop and the instruments, and it's like you were entering into the Renaissance, the 1600s there when you entered his shop. I said, "Would you teach me?" And he said, "No way. You don't know shit. Go learn something and come back, when you know something." And so then I wrote to all these different violin makers in England, and I found somebody that was willing to take on a beginner, and David Vernon in Manchester, England, who was a really good violin maker, but kind of a working class place. They worked on all the instruments of the Manchester BBC orchestras in the north, and just a super down-to-earth place. And he was kind of happy to, show me how to make the basic stuff for making violins. So I spent maybe a year or two, a couple years in Manchester, England.
Okay.
And that's where I started to learn how to make violins. And then after that, I went to Andrew Dipper. I kept communicating with him, and I'd go down there for the weekend sometimes. But then I went there sort of like the equivalent of my master's degree, and I went and spent a couple years with Andrew Dipper, and after that, and continued my violin making studies. And then, violin making is a very complex instrument. So 4 or 5 years of violin making studies, I wouldn't call myself like a really great violin maker.
Okay.
It's like being a good musician or a doctor. You need a lot of years to get really good at it. Maybe 10 years. Depending on your skill and everything, of course. But it's a complex, sophisticated creature that takes a lot of experience to get good at, if you're lucky. So so I became a professional violin maker for like 15 years, after I,
Were you residing in England?
Well, England, I left England and I went back to, we used to go over to Cremona all the time. Cremona is a town in Italy where all the great violin makers came from. Well, where Stradivari came from,
right?
And the family Amati who taught Stradivari, the Amati families. There were families. Mm-hmm. Guarneri, Amati, and Stradivari were the 3 greatest violin making families in the world, and they were all lived within 3 blocks of each other in Cremona, Italy. That was the place.
Okay.
And it still is the place. It still has a violin making school there. So my teacher, Andrew Dipper, had a studio there that he'd go over to from time to time, more to eat and drink wine, but, he taught a little bit at the school there. So I go with him, and I met some Mexicans there, Alvaro, and they said, "Well, you got to come to Mexico when you're done with England, because fuck the United States, come to Mexico." And I was so traumatized by living in England because of the rain. Mm-hmm. Because of the rain, it never stopped raining back then. There's no sun,
right? And
the food and the people and all that stuff. England is a tough place.
It's a gritty place.
It's I had a good time there, but it's not Brazil, And so I ended up.
No, it's not Brazil.
So I went. So then there's a whole nother chapter. But I went to Mexico and opened up a studio with my friend Alvaro, where I spent 3 years in Tepoztlan, Mexico. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How'd that go?
You
say studio. Now talk about that. You talking about art studio? Or are you talking about
violin making studio? Yeah, okay. Alvaro was a violin maker that I met in Cremona.
Right.
And he said, "Come on down when you're ready to. Let's open a studio together." And,
okay.
And then he said, there's this really beautiful town near Mexico City that I want to live. Come and check it out. And we checked it out, and it was a beautiful place called Tepoztlan in the mountains outside of Mexico City. And there was kind of a mix of Mexico City people and artists, because it was like just an hour or so from Mexico City, so
okay.
People could come there. And then the local people that were these very, very, very tough mountain people that, when Zapata's armies were coming through, they hid Zapata and, they protected him. And all the old restaurants there have pictures of Zapata.
Okay.
Still,
Okay.
And everybody has shotguns and stuff. But,
right.
but yeah, so I ended up there, and I had kind of the beginning of a really big Mexican influence on my life. And it's in Mexico when I was making violins. I'd make violins in Mexico.
Okay.
And I'd bring them to the United States to sell, often to Pittsburgh, because I knew people in the Pittsburgh Symphony since I grew up here.
Okay.
And so it enabled me to live down there really well, sell a couple of violins a year. It was a pretty nice lifestyle. But somewhere in that, and I had great adventures in Mexico, and I got deep into the Mexican cultures and the Aztec cultures, and the Mexico is a very colorful place. There's a lot of great painters in Mexico, great writers. It's an extremely cultured country for visual arts. Not only also like connecting to the indigenous cultures, because Mexico is a place that so many towns have their own arts and crafts that are really interesting, and all of that indigenous arts and crafts had always had a big influence on the famous painters in Mexico.
Okay.
Like Rivera and all
Right.
those people were
Right.
very much influenced by the indigenous cultures. You couldn't not be. So anyway, that got me very excited, and then I was like, I'm sick of violin making. I don't want to do this the rest of my life. I want to do sculpture, and I was thinking back to my high school days of making clay and sculptures, and I want to do that. And so
overnight, you just turned it on, or was it a gradual process for you?
It was on the back of my mind,
Okay.
but it was kind of like just like
You
that.
had enough.
Just like that, I was like, it's time for a change.
Okay.
Time to do something else in my creative world. And I remembered that Eugene, Oregon, where I used to go all the time, they offered to the public, the University of Oregon, they offered to the public classes, like without having to go to the university, you could just take one class. And I knew they had a great sculpture facility there with kilns and clay and all that stuff. So I went back to Eugene, Oregon. I said, I'm going to go to Eugene, Oregon. I'm going to take a sculpture class, and I'm going to learn how to fucking make sculpture.
Did you close the studio in Mexico?
Yeah, I left.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, so that's how I, entered back into the sculpture world. And I went to Eugene and rented a little apartment. I was still making violins for my cash, obviously.
Okay.
And I'd make some violins to keep myself going. And then I joined a class. And in Eugene, in the University of Oregon, if you took a class, you had access to the studio whenever there was not a class in the studio, which was every night. So I actually would work all night, every night. I'd go work there in the nights there and have the whole night. And there was always a lot of oddball kids that were doing the same thing. Not quite as oddball as me, but kids that were very excited to make stuff that came in the night. And I befriended some really great people back then.
Okay.
And I taught myself how to make big sculptures. They didn't know how to make them. I asked the teachers. They said, we don't know. There's our library. Look it up. So they just
Where
gave
did that
me
idea come from? The Aztec culture?
to make big sculptures.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, very, very influenced by Mexican ceramics.
Okay.
Not, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the whole deal. Because, if you've ever seen the ceramics that came out of the Mayans and the especially the Mayans and the like around Oaxaca, they're really psychedelic. Mm-hmm. They're just amazing things, gorgeous things. And then, of course, like the Aztecs made big stuff. And I loved that stuff. Very, very strong influence. And also the Mexico, not so much in like the Mayan times, but modern Mexico, there's such a great sense of humor with everything too, which also was, caught on in my brain, because I always feel like you can't. Humor is good. No, not that you make funny art, but that it's not pretentious.
Mm-hmm.
It's just
Mm-hmm.
but because the art world can be a little pretentious.
Just a little.
But anyway, that was the style that I really liked in Mexico.
Okay.
But so anyway, I went to Eugene and I took the classes and I started to make very big sculptures, and they loved me there because there was a guy that he wasn't a student of the school and he wasn't a graduate student,
right?
But he was making big fucking sculptures, and it was great for everybody around to be around somebody that was producing stuff. You know? I think, and so I loved being there, and they liked having me there. So they kind of made it really nice for me. They gave me a space, and I did that for 3 years. I was there 3 years, and they have big kilns and all the clay that you could ever want. So it was like, I took advantage of the facility, because that's something. As soon as you step out of that world, you don't have big kilns, and you don't have all that stuff. It's a whole different thing for students when they leave the colleges. If you're an art, somebody that needs those kinds of facilities. So I made like some 8-9 foot sculptures while I was there out of clay, and that's kind of where I got my start with public art, because I noticed when I put my stuff out, in Eugene there wasn't I often showed it like bank lobbies, there were more places like that didn't mind people showing their stuff. So I would show it in very public places, and I noticed that the public really liked my stuff. Not necessarily like galleries or curators or all that, but just regular people. And that kind of excited me because I always felt like my work was, about and for, just the public in general, and should be out on the street. So that's how I got a sense that that would be a good direction for my work. So
did you go to Sao Paulo from Eugene?
Yeah, Sao Paulo is a whole nother. So Sao Paulo, the connection is that when I was in Mexico during that time,
right,
I befriended a Brazilian guy who was a Tai Chi teacher, Claudio Romanini. He was a really great Tai Chi teacher, and he was from Sao Paulo, Brazil, and he had studied for his younger life with a master Tai Chi teacher, Wong, who has a big academy in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
Okay.
So I always liked Tai Chi, and I studied with him in Mexico. So I befriended Claudio, and we became good friends, and I got into Tai Chi with him, and he said, "You got to come with me to Brazil sometime and meet my Tai Chi teacher, the real deal, the Chinese guy at the academy." And so after I did my thing in Eugene, I arranged to meet Claudio in Brazil.
Okay.
And we went to Brazil together, and then I fell in love with Brazil. So I ended up moving there for 3 years.
Right. And you had a studio there too?
I had a studio there. By then I was mostly doing sculpture stuff. I wasn't doing violin making very much. I was teaching varnish making because there was a lot of interest in how to make varnish, and they didn't know anything about it. And there was a little violin making community in Brazil, so I would teach some workshops and stuff.
How to actually, not to varnish the instrument, but how to make
make varnish, yeah, because we haven't talked about my violin making.
Well, yeah, so the varnish, obviously we think of modern day varnish you'd buy at the hardware store. The
violin making, in my studies of violin making, I learned pretty much everything they knew about how they made violins in the 1700s. Exactly the process Stradivari and his teachers did to create violins, from making varnish to making the instruments and everything involved. And because my teacher Andrew Dipper was this restoration guy, he particularly knew a lot about making varnish, because he had to reproduce original varnishes to match the restoration of these old instruments. So he did a lot of research into how to make varnish from the 1600s and 1500s. So I learned a lot from him about how to make varnish. And back then, the information was not now information is everywhere. You can Google these books and find them online that we had to like really fucking look for back.
It wasn't fair.
You didn't find those things. You had to go and look for those things,
That's funny. That's funny.
But I think in those, the fact that you had to work in a different way to get information, I think you valued the information differently too. I'm not sure like all the access to the information now makes any of us any smarter,
We're overloaded.
Yeah, because there's something in the effort that you have to find the information that helps everything go like deeper inside.
I would agree. It was the pursuit of it.
Yeah, it's like the kind of magic stuff happened from having to pursue it. Where now it's almost like it's like popcorn or something. But so I became very knowledgeable about how to make. If you want to know how to make 16th century violin varnish,
can we talk?
We can make it right now.
Well, I'm sure we probably could. But the whole concept of building the instrument, and I know from my years in the guitar business, I can't say I put my hands in the acoustic factory at Washburn, but I knew enough about the process.
I'll show you this thing.
There has to be some similarities between a lute, acoustic guitar, and a violin. There has to be some similarities, correct?
Well, from what I know about guitar making it's a lot of machines, right? Because the difference with the exception of most guitars have flat tops and flat backs, with the exception of the
electric says a guitar like a Les Paul would have a
like the jazzier ones.
Correct.
So it's a somewhat different in that violins are. I can show you.
Yeah, please.
So this I brought. They see?
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that. Absolutely.
So I brought this is.
So it's chambered.
This is the front and back of a violin. After you have the thick piece of wood, then you cut out the outline,
right?
And then this is the back. It's maple, and it's it's still solid here. And then you carve the shape. So it's a wood carving, and you have these templates. See, like this is a shape. And this was taken from, this was probably taken from whatever this was. This is a Stradivari copy. No, this is Nicholas Amati copy.
Okay.
This was taken from the original instrument. So it shows you the shape of the carving in a particular area. So this is your guide when you're carving. You have the different...
It's like a jig almost, or a small jig,
Yeah, you have the different shapes for the different parts.
Okay.
To give you, here's the long one.
Got it.
It goes that way.
Got it.
And so
that's all by hand.
Yeah. So this is done with wood carving tools, and also you have these. I brought these because they're so cute, and they're the reason I got into violin making. Thumb planes. These are the coolest little things. They're these little planes.
Check that out.
So with wood carving tools and thumb planes, you get it to the shape that it needs to be.
Right.
And then you have these scrapers. I didn't bring scrapers, but they're kind of pieces of metal that are sharp, and you scrape it all to the right shape, and then when that's perfectly right that way, then you turn it over and you dig it out. You dig it out, and then there's precise thicknesses. You have a caliper that shows you the thicknesses. And back in the old days, I should have brought it. I have what Stradivari used. It was kind of a thing that punched holes in it. You could adjust the different thickness of the holes, and then you would carve out until the holes disappeared, and then you punch a little more and carve out, and that's until you got to the thickness that you wanted. And in the violin making, so you make the top and back, and this is this is a 1647 Nicholas Amati. This is the mold. It's taken from the original instrument, the outline. Okay. And it's just temporarily in there.
Oh, so that's not a chamber. That's actually the mold.
This is just the mold.
Okay.
And you use this because this is the exact shape that you need that came from the original instrument
Okay.
to build the sides around. So you bend the sides and you and they come around there, and then there's these blocks, and the blocks, they're glued to the blocks.
Right.
And eventually you knock these, you just tap these and you can pull this thing
Got
out.
it.
So this just keeps the shape.
When you bend the sides, James, is that done? Do you wet the wood when you do? Is it a process?
Yeah, it's just a hot iron, like a round iron that's standing up.
Okay.
And you just put dampen the wood and just it bends very easy.
Okay.
After 10 years of practice.
Absolutely right. Is there a is that
same as guitars though? They bend them on
right.
those big heated things.
Is that a certain kind of maple?
The back. Well, and of course in those days it was all European maple. The wood is crucial for the sound. All this came from the Alps, and the Alps, because it has a slower growing season.
Because of the cold, correct?
Because of the colds.
Right.
So both it's all about the grain of the wood.
Right.
The grain's very, like guitars, the grain's very
prominent,
close together. And also on these things, the maple has grain too, and it's close together, and it goes that way. So it's about, but so that gives it strength too.
Is that two pieces of maple on the top? Is that split down the center?
Yeah, these are joined. Sometimes you can use one piece, but they are often you joined them down the center. The same with the tops. So
that's is that the bottom there?
This is the top.
That's the top.
The top is a kind of pine or spruce,
that was my question.
Like the same as a guitar top.
Got it. I could tell it wasn't maple, and I was just curious what wood that was.
So in the violin making world, it's a little different than the guitar world. The top is a softwood, and the back and sides are maple, which is a kind of a semi-hardwood. And the top is more like a drum skin. It's like flexible, thinking of it as a drum skin with pressure on it from the bridge. And then the back is more the creature that springs the sound out. Right. So it hits the back and springs it out. And it's a fairly complex system with archings too, because they were pretty smart in the Renaissance. They knew how to build incredible. They were great architects, because violin making is architecture. It's all the stuff they knew in the Renaissance combined into a musical instrument. It's architecture, archings, and mathematics, and they're also completely aware of mathematics relating to like acoustics. Mm-hmm. And it's like all there's these like the golden thing with mathematics. There's proportions, and all these proportions, when you draw them out, they weren't just like this is more or less the shape it should be. They actually knew exactly what worked, with the mathematics and the arching and the thickness and all that stuff. And I think modern violin makers, our goal has always been to understand, not just to copy the instrument is not enough, because every piece of wood is different. So you have to actually understand what makes the sound good, and that's why violin making is an art. You just can't copy a Stradivari, the same exact arching and stuff, because each piece of wood is different. So you have to understand what is needed. One piece of wood need to be like twice as way thicker than another piece of wood because of the nature of the wood.
Let me ask you this: in regards to the varnish, you talk about making vintage varnish, right? You're making the chemicals.
These are the scrolls too.
Got it.
There's one before and one after it's carved. So, yeah.
In guitars, I know that what was craved on acoustics, on the higher end acoustics, was either a nitrocellular lacquer, and I guess the concept was it was porous, it would let the instrument breathe, and it would age well from an acoustic standpoint. That's what we were always told, as opposed to overseas at times in the smaller shops where they crank them out, they would use a urethane or something that would actually seal the instrument, and it wouldn't resonate as much. that varnish you're referring to, is the way it interacts with the wood, it is special because it's tone related, or is it more cosmetic related?
It's definitely both, but 100% tone related.
Okay.
You know, the good varnish, you know, affects the tone dramatically.
Okay.
You know, you need to know how to either buy or make good varnish. You know, the violin has to be made really well and sound good no matter what. You know, the good varnish isn't going to make a shitty violin sound great, but a really good violin could be seriously hampered by crappy varnish. You know? Okay. And I mean, in Stradivari's day, they mostly used oil varnish. You know, it was you know, this the level of knowledge about making varnish and color was so high in those days. They knew how to distill because in the painting industry, you know, painting was obviously a huge thing in just all the colors had been, you know, they'd been learning how to make colors from, there was only the natural environment back in those days. So for all the great paintings, you know, there was a lot of information out there for the violin makers already, because, you know, you have a wealth of painting, you know, going on.
Right.
So, but for, you know, violin making, violins are particular in that the varnish has to be transparent. You know, if you look at varnish, good violins, you can see straight through to the grain, and it's all sparkly and beautiful. And oil varnish is it's difficult to make oil varnish because you have to get the oil to you have to get the color into the oil, you know, and that's often a complex procedure. That's chemistry. And they knew how to do that, and I know how to do that.
Right.
A lot of modern violin makers know how to do that, but you have to make, you know, like if you go to the store and you buy paints these days, they have like madder lakes, and you see the word lakes. A lake is I don't know anymore if I have the scientific correctness of the definition, but you have to attach the color to a salt, you know, aluminium sulfate, and once it's attached to a salt, it'll go into oil. So the color itself, like a water, you know, if you have a beautiful color that's in water, it won't go into oil. You have to attach it to something that'll dissolve in oil. Got it. And so that's one of the challenges of and like I said, there was a lot of that made for the oil painting in those days, but it didn't have to be transparent. Got it. For violin making, it had to be also transparent. So you know, they figured out how to do all that and make beautiful varnish. And then besides that, it had to be the right consistency for the acoustics. So not too brittle, not too flexible, you know, somewhere in the middle. And on top of that, you had to know how to treat the wood before you actually varnished it, because they always had a ground on violins, and you didn't just put the oil right into the wood, or it would sink in and make it kind of, you know, muted. So and one of the things about Stradivari was he has a museum in Cremona. That he was a very, very organized violin maker. He was definitely the top of the line genius guy. Even though he inherited an enormous amount of information, he was a great artist. And he kept extremely detailed records of everything he did. Everything, templates, molds, everything is there. Everything except the varnish.
So they can try to copy me, but they'll never quite.
I don't think it was his intention. I think the varnish records were hidden by whoever. You know, they had strong guilds in those days through the churches. Sure. And there's no doubt he had you know, if you make varnish, there's nothing more than you need to have a lot of precise notes about all your experiments. There's no doubt Stradivari had an enormous amount of documentation about his varnish making, but there's not one bit of sign of that it's been hidden or locked in the vaults in Rome, or who knows where it is. But yeah, we were left with some big gaps in
that you had to fill in.
A lot of people had to do a lot of research to figure out
That process there, that, as you described it to me, and again, you're not even getting detail. We're just talking about the general tenets of violin building. That is so more advanced. That makes almost like making an acoustic dreadnought guitar sound like playing with Legos. There just seems to be so much more involved, and every little nuance of that matters.
Yeah, I think violins are pretty sophisticated. I think any instrument, guitars, there's a lot to making a great guitar. You probably know more about it than me. I mean, Stradivari made guitars too, beautiful guitars. And there was a lot of guitars made in those days. Not, like what they are today, but there was a lot of guitars of all kinds of, and the thickness and the bracing. I think the bracing has a lot to do with, the
acoustic for sure.
And of course the wood and all that stuff. But I think the violin making is, it's more complex.
Is it generally always maple? And I'm guessing that's a spruce on the top. Is it?
Yeah, it's pretty much. There have been some violins where the backs have been poplar.
Okay.
But I think that's unusual.
Okay.
And I think it's probably who knows why. The maker had a bad month and couldn't afford the maples, so he had to. They don't necessarily sound bad, but yeah, for the most part, all the great instruments were made with maple sides and back. And
can you estimate how many you've made and sold?
I probably not a huge amount, maybe 40 or so.
Okay.
I'm not really sure. I made some cellos too.
Okay.
And violas, violin family stuff.
Right.
Yeah. My violins were pretty good, If I would have kept doing it, I'd probably have more money than I have now, but not necessarily more fun. So.
Got it. Never the urge to go back and do it again?
No, at first I thought I would be able to do both, make sculpture and do violin making, but it takes an enormous amount of dedication to do one or the other.
Okay.
And and also the business side of it too.
Sure.
You need to really, be able to put all your focus on it, and I couldn't do both.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Well, talk about coming back to the States. You came back to Pittsburgh in 2000. Is that correct? Roughly speaking.
Yeah, I came back because my dad had a stroke, and I came back to see him.
Okay.
And then I realized when I came back, he had a pretty bad stroke. So I decided I would help my mother take care of him for a while, just to she needed help.
Sure.
And I was able to do that, and I could really go wherever I wanted, so it was possible. I have, my two sisters, wasn't so easy for them to do. Well, my one sister lives in Pittsburgh, so she was in the picture, but the other one lives in Boston. So I committed to coming back. So I moved back here to help my mother take care of my dad.
Okay.
We're all very close. So
Sure.
It was an easy move for me. If I didn't like my parents, it would have been harder. But
sure.
But
you had been away for a long time though, in terms of living here
since high school. Yeah.
Wow. So
I know this was I never in my wildest, I wouldn't say dreams, maybe more nightmares. Thought people always say, "Oh, well, you always come back to Pittsburgh, don't you?" No. It's not because I was. Realized after all my travels that Pittsburgh was the dream place in the world.
How about that for an honest statement?
It's like,
well, the studio. How'd that come about?
But that brought me back to Pittsburgh. The studio came. My friend Rick Schweikert was just starting out. I befriended my friend Rick, and he was just starting out in the real estate business, like in 2000. And so, back in 2000, which doesn't seem like that long ago, but time flies, everything was still dirt cheap in Pittsburgh.
Right.
I grew up on Stanton Avenue in Stanton Heights, which is just right above Lawrenceville. So I was really familiar with, I grew up right in that world of Lawrenceville.
Mm-hmm.
And really, you could buy anything in 2000 in Lawrenceville. There was nothing happening there.
Oh, yes.
It was like and we rode around just for fun because he was just learning about real estate.
Right.
I was kind of fascinated by building. We'd just drive around and say, "Oh, maybe you could get this for your studio." Or we looked around Lawrenceville and we looked at different parts of the city, and then we drove by this warehouse in Uptown, and I saw that and I said, I want to buy that building. That's the building I want to buy.
Just like that.
Just like it was definitely love at first sight.
Okay.
And it was this 3-story warehouse that had gigantic 12-foot fences around the whole outside perimeter, and it was just looked like it was filled with garbage and junk that the windows were about to explode. And those are the kind of buildings that we learned that maybe you can buy because they're sort of abandoned and filled with stuff, but not really being used.
Right.
It wasn't for sale. And so Rick figured out, on his computer who the owner was, who turned out to live next door. And then he was this eccentric Irish guy. And over a period of months, Rick negotiated with him to sell me the building.
Okay.
Over a period of 6 months. He had to talk.
Okay.
He had to negotiate with him every day for 6 months. I kid you not. Rick's skill as a real estate agent came from, he used to be a bartender.
Okay.
And he was really good at talking to people. And he outdid himself on this. It took a while to get the building.
But he got it.
But we got it, yeah. And, yeah.
So you have turned this, that's also your residence? Is that true?
Yeah. So I've slowly fixed it up, and I work there and live there and everything. Yeah.
Okay. And the courtyard is where you hold the performances, right?
No, my third floor where I live is also where in the wintertime all the shows are on my third floor.
Okay.
Because I kept it fairly open, so it's like a loft kind of space. And you can fit like 70 or 80 people in there with chairs and stuff. So, it's where I live on my third floor. It's like a big open space.
So I thought I saw in the courtyard, though, were you holding any events in the courtyard?
So and then in the summertime, I have a big backyard, which is probably what you saw.
Okay.
And that backyard is, it's a big backyard surrounded by fences and bamboo and stuff. And we have a lot of shows in the backyard in the summertime.
Okay.
Because, it's super nice to do shows outside.
I bet.
Yeah.
For a period of time, you were doing, I think it was called... Did you call it? Is it Gist or is it Gist? Am I pronouncing it correctly?
I call it Gist Street.
Yeah, I don't know if it's Gist or Gist either. But you were holding readings there, whether it was writers or poetry. Yeah,
the early on when I met Rick, the real estate guy, his wife is Sherry Flick, who was a writer then and is a writer now. And she always had a idea to have a reading series. And I was coming off of like living in Brazil and in Mexico, and I kind of missed the lifestyle you had in those countries where everybody always came to your places, and it was very much more openly social. Where the United States, people tend to be isolated, or you have to make an appointment to come visit somebody.
Okay.
So I like the idea of we felt like we needed to do something fun, In the reading world, reading series tend to be really boring. They're in the back of bars or in a lecture hall. And so Sherry's idea was, let's do something different that people never do for readings. Let's just make it fun. Let's have booze. Let's have food.
It usually makes things fun.
Mostly let's have booze and food and a very little amount of reading.
So they're impromptu parties,
and that's
right?
kind of what we did in potluck. And the readings were actually very short. There was 2 readers, and they were allowed 20 minutes each. And then it was really popular right from the beginning, I think because of those reasons, because, nobody had ever come to a reading that was, my place was kind of cool. You came into a sculpture studio, an interesting building.
Right.
And then it was just a fun atmosphere, to hear readings. And then Sherry and later on Nancy Flick, they were really good at picking writers from across the country. So they found a lot of really good quality writers, poets and writers, and it became known as a really popular place to try to be, read your stuff. And it became a really popular place for people to come. People were lined up like all the way down the street, like 2 or 3 hours before it started.
Incredible.
To my complete amazement. I'm like, really? It's so fucking boring. Reading.
It's my backyard.
Well, you don't have anything better to do? So we did that for 10 years. It was a very successful venture. And the gals kind of got tired of it after 10 years. We kind of stopped when it was definitely at the peak of its popularity.
Interesting.
Because we would get 70, 80, 90 people every month. And I think it's just a lot of work to organize that.
Sure.
And I think especially Sherry, wanted to do other stuff besides.
Okay.
It was just, every month you had to deal with a lot of the dynamics of having writers come and just the whole thing.
Sure.
So
The coordination
it was
of it
time
all.
to, 10 years was a really good stretch, so for a reading series,
Well, we before we end today, we have to talk a little bit about some of your more well-known pieces of work here, sir. Tell me about the three musicians.
Yeah, the three musicians were when I first came when I was back in Pittsburgh. Rick again, who my friend, he got a job with EMp Picker when he first came to Pittsburgh. EMp Picker is a local developer that's she's done a lot of, in my opinion, a lot of really groundbreaking stuff in Pittsburgh over the years, especially for a woman, dealing with the man's world of development. And she kind of, I think she was one of the people that first started fixing up buildings downtown, turning them into lofts, and she did started the whole thing, I think, in the Garfield area too. And so anyway, she owned this building downtown, and next door she was going to build a building, and she wanted to have a courtyard. So she wanted the building to be set back and have a courtyard. And the legality in those days, I don't know if it is now, where you needed to have the facade of the front of the building continue for every building that you had.
Okay.
In other words, they were basically saying you can't have a courtyard. Like, it was radical to have a courtyard. If you can believe that, It's like it didn't fit in.
I kind of believe it.
It didn't fit in with like the continuation of the streetscape.
Sure.
So she had the idea of the way to continue the streetscape and have a courtyard would be to have sculptures in the front that would continue it. So Rick showed her my work, and she loved my work.
Right.
And so she asked me if I would design some sculptures for it. And that's how, so I designed the musicians, which kind of made sense with, tied into Pittsburgh's music history.
Right.
And also tied into my whole experiences, especially in Brazil, being surrounded by all kinds of music and very inspired by that too. So I designed the three musicians, and she commissioned me to make them. Yeah.
When I announced last night, just on social media, that I put up your documentary, and I said, hey, I'm going to sit down with James. I had 3 people, friends of mine, immediately message me, those musicians, you're going to sit down with James, ask him about the musicians.
Yeah, they were my first really large scale commission.
That was my question. They were the first then.
And they got me. I'd made big sculptures before, but nothing like that. And it was a pretty major. It was a great opportunity to make big sculptures for downtown. And me and my friend John, who had just moved to Pittsburgh, and helped me do it, and we just figured out how to do it, and we did it. It was a lot of fun.
Well, what about Tampa? The park in Tampa, did that come right after that?
No, Tampa was more recently.
Okay.
The Tampa was in 2016.
Okay.
Yeah, I've made a few, several big sculptures. I did a big sculpture in Cleveland.
Right.
One in Chattanooga. Tampa was 2, 3, 4 big sculptures and 2 or 3 big dogs, and it was a pretty big installation. Yeah. The ones downtown in Pittsburgh definitely helped me, to get other
Right.
gigs.
Right.
You have to be able to show your stuff to get other stuff. So
The scale, and I've looked at a lot of the photos on your website and also on the web. A lot of them are in process where you're kind of posing with it's just awesome because the scale is there. There's a
the big is always exciting for me. I like making big stuff. I mean the artistically, those things are 10% super fun artistically and 90% nightmare labor,
I would think,
because it's like it's construction. You have to build big armatures and everything's heavy, and there's a lot in making plaster molds, because we make they're made in clay,
right?
And then plaster molds are made, and then they're cast in concrete. So there's a lot of processes to get the finished product.
And just transporting them. Getting them from point A to point B.
Well, they're made the ones downtown were made in pieces. We made everything so that 2 people could deal with it, more or less.
Okay.
I had a funky little Ford Ranger that brought every single piece of those sculptures to downtown in my Ford Ranger. Just pile them up in sections and take them down there. And then John was Fleenwer, who helped me, was he used to work on boats in Alaska, so he knew how to tie all these fancy knots, that all boat people know. So we got just this hand cranked, like, construction thing that you can rent, that like you lift up lumber with. You crank it up; it has a hook on the end, and he just tied each section up, and we cranked it up, and we just lowered it down onto. They were made in like 2-foot sections, like donuts, and you just stacked one on top of the other after the other, and once they were up a few feet, you'd fill that with concrete, and then you'd continue to stack them up. So.
But you had to ship the Florida pieces, right?
The Florida ones were another story. We made them not in so many pieces, because the less pieces you have to put together on site, the better. So I tried to make them more like in 3 pieces.
Right.
And then so we had to have forklifts and cranes and stuff to get them into the truck when they were all ready, and then cranes to pull them off of the truck and put them on the site.
It had to
and
be
all that.
nerve-wracking, right? I mean,
it's kind of fun,
For you, I think everything is
if you know
fun.
what you're doing. If you know what you're doing, it's kind of fun. It's a little bit nerve-wracking because they're just heavy, and you gotta.
Yeah.
The crane guy in Pittsburgh was super nervous. I wasn't so nervous because they're hard to break. Even if you drop them, they're tough.
Yeah.
But he told me he was like super nervous when he was lifting them up and dropping them on the truck. But yeah.
In the documentary that was produced about you a couple years ago, there was a Ohio organization. I think it was the Buckeye organization.
Yeah.
And they commissioned a piece by you for a park in a suburb of Cleveland. Is that correct?
Yeah, Buckeye neighborhood.
And is it a trumpet player?
Yeah, trumpet man.
Trumpet man, excuse me.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, as I was watching that, they were the members of that association were lamenting that the economy was bad. There was a lot of vacant houses at the time, and they were talking about the importance of public art. And one of the very first questions I wanted to ask you, and we never got there, but what is your definition of that? If someone says to you, you make large scale public art as opposed to art that's in a gallery that people pay. What is, in your opinion, public art?
I mean, for me, it's pretty simple. It's just art that's out in the public.
Okay, well,
really,
well,
for the public. For me, it's for the public.
For the public.
Yeah, for me, it's for the public. I mean, maybe another public artist would say something different. But
okay,
like I said earlier, like I've always felt like my work was for the public. But
okay.
I mean, public art is, it means it's out in the public for everybody can see it,
And yours is so striking because of the scale and the size.
Yeah.
Which lends itself to set to town squares or to be outside.
Yeah, in sculpture, big is definitely better. Other areas I can't say, but and I didn't discover that myself. If you look throughout history, you can go to like Vietnam and Thailand, and you'll find these Buddhas that are just mind-blowingly big, carved out of mountains,
right?
That kind of stuff. I just love that stuff, big and grand, and I just love the big stuff.
And you're still doing mosaics, correct?
Yeah, I do mosaics too. And the interesting thing, the one of the things talking about public art is that I've always liked the idea of putting artwork in communities that don't have anything.
Right.
I think that's like to bring artwork to places that really need it. It's also nice to be commissioned to make something.
Well, sure. In
an affluent downtown somewhere. Although when we made it downtown in Pittsburgh, that was still the red light district down there. That wasn't. Right. It was a fairly seedy neighborhood.
Right.
But when we did the one in Cleveland for the Trumpet Man, that was a neighborhood very similar to the Hill District. It got hit heavy by blight from the home, all the mortgage schemes and whatever, and a lot of neighborhoods throughout the country.
Right.
And nobody ever did anything nice for those neighborhoods, And I think the people were a little weary at first, but when you put it up there and they're like, "Oh, this is so nice, and you did this for us," and it's super cool to be able to, bring something nice to those places.
Do you feel
in Braddock too? Because I did the Welcome to Braddock sign.
That. Right.
I met John Fetterman back in his early days of Braddock, when really he was just starting to try to get people interested to come there. And I was, he was surprised when I met him and he asked me if I would do something there. I think he was a little surprised I was interested to do something there, but I was, I really enjoyed, going to Braddock and meeting all the high school kids there and making something really pretty to put there and stuff.
So I know we laughed about Pittsburgh and coming back to Pittsburgh and the gray skies and all, especially from where you were living prior. But you do love this city, don't you?
That's a good question.
See, I love the honesty. Well, your work, you give me the feeling that you do.
I love the city, but I'm really a warm weather guy. I kind of,
that's great. That's so great.
Yeah.
Well, I think most of us, given the preference, probably are, James.
Some of the charm that I like about the city in many ways is disappearing.
Okay.
Because when I came back to Pittsburgh, it was to help out my parents.
Right.
And I love the way Pittsburgh, everybody's, wants the youth to come to Pittsburgh and all that stuff, and the tech people. But I always thought the charming thing about Pittsburgh was the old people there. All these old restaurants,
right?
Like Moray's in Oakland, where you'd go and they were still singing around the piano and stuff. And that generation's pretty much dying out now. But and with that was also the property was very cheap to buy here.
No question.
And I think that was also a very nice plus for Pittsburgh is the property. It's still affordable, but
some areas
it was much easier to it still amazes me that I was able to buy a property in Pittsburgh. I never really had the lifestyle where I could completely figure out how to buy a property. But so I do love Pittsburgh because it was easy to buy a property here. I watch the Steelers.
You almost are obliged to say that in this town, right?
I root for the Steelers.
Do you actually like football? Do you like sports?
I like watching the studio.
Okay, yeah. I asked that question because I've met a lot of artists that just could care less about.
I think it's fun. I'm waiting for
another Super Bowl. We all are.
I think Antonio Brown should come back.
Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh! Yeah, that's almost its own sideshow in and of itself, day in, day out, almost. So you're taking commissions, of course, right?
I do. Yep.
Okay, so let me ask you this question then: when you take a commission based upon your style of work, is it tough because anyone that's going to commission you is going to have to give you a significant amount of latitude, right, in terms of interpretation? I always wondered about that. I mean, if you had a realism painting, like if you were going to get a portrait done in oil and you wanted it to be realistic, I guess, whatever they call that, to be very precise.
Realistic.
Yeah. So that's that's understandable. But if someone wants a commission from you, the process, how does that work in communication with the client?
Yeah, well, there's different, there's, in the sculpture world, there's sculptors that they make realistic stuff. That's their thing.
Right. Let me get you a little closer to that mic so I don't lose you. There we go.
Like in the sculpture world, there's people like Susan Wagner, who's from Pittsburgh, who did like the Roberto Clemente sculpture at the baseball field. Like their specialty is realistic stuff, more classical. Where I do what I do, which is it's figurative, but it's just my own, more free impressionistic style, whatever you would call it.
Right.
But it's so I think people see my work. If they like my work, they have a pretty good idea what it looks like. So within that, they're not, if they say, well, we want an exact portrait of so and so, I'll say, well, no, it's not. Look at my work.
Yeah, that's not what you do.
That's not what I do. You can find plenty of people that do that really well. So
got it.
So in other words, they have to like my style.
All right.
And within that, I can design, a lot of things. It's just always going to be within, my style.
For an individual, let's say all the commissions you've done for not an organization or a business, but for an individual, what was the largest piece you ever made?
I did for, well, bear in mind that the Liberty Avenue Musicians was for an individual.
True. Good point.
That was
good point.
Actually a private, even though it's public.
It is public art.
2 inches from the actual street. It's on private property. That 2 inches,
very important 2 inches,
made it possible.
Understood.
But I don't do that much private actually. Stuff. I did a private sculpture in Eugene for that was like 9 feet tall, a portrait of Paganini, and Paganini was he was a famous kind of the Jimi Hendrix of the 1800s.
I've seen guitar players play his
he wrote
his works.
Guitar
It's
stuff
incredible.
too, yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah, he was a wild guy. So I did something like that, and sometimes I do some private mosaic stuff. But most of the large scale stuff is public stuff.
Yeah,
public art stuff. Yeah.
Outside the mosaics and the sculpture, do you ever paint?
No, I mean, I've played around with it, but it's not really my, where I focus my stuff.
You're not drawn to it.
Everything I make in the mosaic and sculpture world, I draw out. I sketch out fairly accurately, but no, I don't really paint. I think the mosaics is my form of painting.
Got it.
It's how I like to paint.
I get it.
I feel like my mosaics I approach from completely painting point of view.
Okay.
I look a lot at like Matisse and people like that when I do mosaics.
Okay.
Yeah.
Speaking of influences, not that I probably know half these historical art influences, but you speak of Matisse. Who else is in art history is an influence on you?
Miles Davis.
Now that one I can relate to.
Yeah,
I asked for it.
well, because I'm probably more influenced by music.
By music, okay.
You know, than
okay.
And then, you know, I love all the great classical stuff.
Pitch's Brew, right? Wasn't that was one of his?
Yeah. I love all the, like we were talking about earlier when I traveled to Europe, and I spent a lot of time in Greece.
Right.
Well, Greece is kind of the heart of where all the great classical sculpture started.
Uh-huh.
And I spent and it was back when I didn't really even know that I was going to be an artist or whatever, but I just saw so many places full of sculptures, Greek sculptures. And I just loved that stuff.
Okay.
And then, of course, Italy, I go to Florence quite a lot just to look at the Michelangelo sculptures and the paintings and, of course, the food more than anything.
Of course, the food.
But then, like Pittsburgh-wise, there's, Romare Bearden, you know who he is? Romare Bearden was this wonderful African-American artist that spent at least part of his career in Pittsburgh.
Okay.
And he did a mix of collage and painting and a lot of, Pittsburgh scenes from steel mills to music scenes. And they're quite beautiful.
I'll have to look him up.
And, he definitely have an influence on him with my mosaics, especially because the way he put together his paintings and collages kind of helps me with my mosaics.
All right.
And, of course, like Picasso and all that, those people you don't want to look at too much because you just kind of, then people are just going to say, oh, you looks like a Picasso.
Yeah, I understand completely.
I'm very influenced by the Mexican painter, the Mexican mural painters. Not so much Dali. I mean, everybody kind of loves Dali, but
it's weird.
It's
very weird.
His melty stuff, but I mean, Dali is obviously a great artist, but I'm more like the Mexican painters, like Tamayo and all the Mexican mural painters. I love their stuff, and also the ancient pre-Columbian sculptures we were talking about,
right?
Like you see in Oaxaca and Aztecs and the Mayans and all that stuff is okay. I love all that stuff. Yeah.
Do you currently market your work like in galleries? Do you have it on display at your studio? Do you take private appointments? How do you market your current work?
Yeah, you should teach me how to do that. I don't have any idea how I market my stuff. I'm like I said, I grew up Jewish, but I didn't probably pick the best qualities of the Jewish tradition.
So business was never your thing.
I mean,
you've obviously done very well for yourself.
I've survived. I don't know if I've never been driven by business. I've really truthfully been driven by being excited to make stuff.
Right. Right.
I mean, as an artist, you want to get paid good.
Well, sure.
And you try to make that happen, especially the longer you're into it, because the art world is a world where artists are, for some god awful reason, they're expected to do so much for free or for cheap. But in the public art world, there's 2 or 3 ways public artists get gigs. One is if they're famous and people are just lining up to have their work. I'm not exactly that level. The other is there's all these online opportunities that any city that has public art that they need to have an artist. They're often required to have a national call or an international call, so they put out the job description.
Right.
And if somebody like me reads it and I think it's something they'd be interested in, then you apply for it and you send your letter of interest and all that stuff.
Okay.
So I do that like every month. I send out a few letters of interest, and the competition's huge. that's how I got the Tampa gig. But hundreds of people apply for them every time you send one out.
Got it.
There's hundreds of people that are sending them out.
Got it.
So you're basically doing a job interview every few months to find another gig. It's like you get fired and you have to find another job every 2 months. And then locally, it's more word of mouth.
Okay.
So, So.
Did you have fun?
Yeah, that was. Yeah, I hope
this was tremendous.
I hope it wasn't too.
Oh, it was tremendous.
Boring for
now,
you.
in the story of your life and just the experiences alone, we just touched just the surface today.
Yeah, it's hard to.
But what an incredible life! What an incredible life, and the traveling alone and the experiences, and actually, James, having the I mean, maybe it was youth, I don't know, but having that fearless mentality just to up and go.
Yeah,
is
I do realize
amazing.
I mean, because I have a lot of interns that come and work for me, and,
right?
From Carnegie Mellon and other universities,
right.
And I like high school kids and college kids and stuff, and I'm also kind of fascinated. Like what are they doing? But not too many. Some of them travel, but not too many.
Right.
It's surprising how unambitious, or maybe just how little guts a lot of the youth have these days for going out there and seeing what's going on.
Do you think the technology just has made the world smaller, but at the same time has kind of shown them, whether it's stills and video, which again is not being there, I understand that, but it's giving them somewhat of a feel for all these places, and they're not as compelled to travel? Is that possible?
I think it's similar to what we were talking about, like with research with Violin varnish and stuff.
Okay.
It's like it's so easy to see all these places that maybe it kills some of the ambition to actually go out. And I don't know if that's true, though. Like I said, for me, it was in my blood, and I think there's probably always that small amount of people at any time in history that have it in their blood to go out there and do that. So,
yeah, and the adventure of it all, and what an adventure! There's a book in here. Like, have you ever thought about writing?
I think one of the things that for me that was most fascinating about hitchhiking, that most people will never know that haven't hitchhiked a lot, is it's an incredible way to learn about a culture, because you leave Pittsburgh, a little bit about Pittsburgh culture, but then all kinds of different types of people picks you up, and you enter into so many different worlds that you get. It gave me a great, insight and taste of all kinds of different people. Because I think one of the problems in countries like this in general in the world right now is like racism and all that stuff. I think it often comes from people not having good exposure to all kinds of different cultures. They never travel, or when they do travel, it's in a very, kind of like to a resort or something, and they never mix with people.
Right.
And one of the things I loved about Peabody High School was that I was thrown in all of a sudden with black kids and Italian kids and just all kinds of kids, and I loved that, right from the beginning. I loved meeting all these different people.
Yeah. And
I think that's probably the greatest way to break down boundaries. And
I think you're absolutely onto something. As a father of a 19 and a 17-year-old, I've watched them kind of grow up with technology, and there's things about how they and their friends communicate, which is so foreign to what I remember as a kid. Whether it was going out and socializing, going out to an event together and there wasn't any technology. I think we're so ingrained in that device we're holding right now, and it really is a different kind of society now. Yeah,
technology definitely doesn't help people communicate better, even though it's all about communication. It actually it doesn't help people communicate. It just makes it possible to to talk to everybody.
Yeah.
But it doesn't actually. I think one of the things that technology that I dislike most about technology right now is how impersonal it's made people's. You know, the people email you, they don't even say hello. You know, it's just blah, 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 blah. And that's all little stuff, but in the end, it's like, it's made it very impersonal a lot of the time.
Very much so. And we've had multiple guests on that echoed your sentiments exactly, where email, and now I think it really has gotten bad in the last 10 years with texting, because texting is the thing now, you know, and that's very impersonal. And there was a little more formality, I thought, years ago with email. That was to me, that's still the last bastion of like formal communication. But now it's just this whole world, and everybody expects an answer immediately. Like if you know, if someone texts me, I think if I don't get back to them in a half an hour, they think something's wrong with me. So
I was thinking about how the different levels of traveling through history, and like in the old days, guys would leave their wives and go off on a ship, and you might not see them for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years.
You wait for letters, right?
You know, and then, you know, in my time where I'd go traveling and there was still no cell phones, and
right.
You know, once a month maybe you'd call your parents from collect from somewhere and send, you know, aerograms, if you remember what those were.
Yeah, I do.
To where now it's like, you know, if your kid travels, of course, it's a delight for parents because you know where they are every minute of every second of every day. But it changes the kind of relationship you have, for better or worse, you know, because you don't really have like you have to have a lot more kind of faith and confidence in your kid and the world, right? Because they're going out and you just got to trust they're going to be okay.
Yeah,
so that's all kind of gone, you know.
They're tethered. Everybody's tethered. Now, instantly, and that's in a whole nother conversation in itself. But that, you're right, and that doesn't just affect relationships like that. It affects the way we interact with each other on all bases, whether it's in business, personal, whether it's socializing. I don't know if the generation below us or the generations below us really socialize in a way that you and I would really understand. You know, I think it's just something different going on where they can all sit in a room and text each other instead of having a conversation. That's so foreign to what we knew, how we lived our life. You know?
It's great for dating, though.
I will take your word for it. With the impersonal nature of it all.
Yeah.
Incredible. Thank you, James.
And
they can reach you at simonsculpture.com. Is that correct?
Yeah, all my information is
it's all
on
there.
The website there, yeah.
All right, my friend.
Yeah.
We'll do this again someday.
Yeah, anytime. Sure.
Yeah, but you have enough material in your life, my friend, for a screenplay or a book. I hope you think about that.
Yeah, just the whole Oregon time.
Alone,
like Ken Kesey lived like the next farm over from us, and that was a great fun time. And in the 70s in Eugene, Oregon was pretty wild. The Grateful Dead were just coming up and all this stuff. And
I'll have you back on for more stories, buddy.
Okay.
For sure.
Thank you.
You betcha. Thank you. We are out.
All right.
Wow.
Good luck editing that. My God.
I don't think there's anything I got to take out of there. I'm not going to take a damn thing out. What do you mean? There's nothing to take out. I think I stumbled through my words. You didn't stumble. That was tremendous.
It's kind of fun to remember all that stuff.
Fingertips above the water, you watch me drown. You could have saved me, but you let me down. Yeah.